Picture this. You are standing on the edge of the world, a jagged precipice of rock and ice known only to the eagles and the unforgiving wind. Below you, a chasm of swirling white. A blizzard has swallowed the Montana Territory whole, erasing the lines between heaven and earth. The cold is a physical thing, a phantom hand squeezing the very breath from your lungs. But the man standing before you is colder still. His name is Mayor Thompson, and his face, framed by the fur of his expensive coat, is a mask of possessive fury. He owns the town below. He owns the law, and he believes he owns you. He gives you a choice, his voice a low growl nearly lost to the screaming wind. Return to his gilded cage, be the beautiful bird that sings only for him, or be given to the storm. What do you do when your only act of defiance is to choose the fall? For a young woman named Ilara, this was not a choice. It was a declaration. Her refusal, a single whispered word of no, was the spark that lit the fuse. His hand shot out, not in anger, but with a chilling, deliberate finality. The push was gentle, almost casual, and then there was no ground beneath her feet. There was only the dizzying plunge into a void of pure, blinding white. The sky and the earth became one, and the last thing she knew was the silent, screaming fall. Her story had begun 6 months earlier with the dust of the trail and a heart full of desperate hope. Redemption Creek was the name on the map, a name that promised a new beginning. Ilara had come west with nothing but a tattered photograph of her parents and a spirit that had been bent but not yet broken by a life of hardship. Mayor Thompson had seen her the day she arrived, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes holding a light he craved to possess. He had offered her a job in his office, a room in the town's finest boarding house, and the illusion of protection. At first, it felt like salvation. The town was prosperous, the people were deferential, and the mayor was a pillar of civic strength. But soon, the gilded cage began to show its bars. His compliments became commands. His gifts came with unspoken conditions. He isolated her, turning townsfolk against her with sly whispers and veiled threats, until her world shrank to the size of his shadow. He was a collector, and she was to be his most prized acquisition. The moment she realized this, the moment she saw the deadness in his eyes when she spoke of her own dreams, was the moment her hope curdled into fear. She made a plan to flee, to slip away in the night. But he was always watching. He cornered her, his words dripping with a venomous sweetness, and offered to take her for a carriage ride to clear the air, a ride that ended on that windswept bluff. Now, she lay at the bottom of it, a broken doll half buried in a drift of fresh snow. A searing pain radiated from her arm, and the world was a blurry watercolor of gray and white. The will to live, however, is a stubborn, primal thing. She tried to move, a moan of agony catching in her throat, but the blizzard was a crushing weight, stealing her warmth, promising the long, peaceful sleep of death. It was then that a shape emerged from the whiteout, a figure as stark and rugged as the mountains themselves. A man, leading a pack mule, stopped. For a moment, he just stared down at her. His face weathered and hard, bisected by a faint, silver scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to the edge of his mouth. This was Silas, a man who had come to these mountains to escape the world of men, a recluse haunted by ghosts he could not outrun. Getting involved was the last thing he wanted. His heart was a fortress, its walls built of loss and regret. But as he looked at the woman at his feet, at the fierce, stubborn flicker of life still in her eyes, he saw a reflection of a promise he had failed to keep long ago. With a sigh that plumed like a ghost in the frigid air, he knelt, his movements sure and economical. He gently splinted her arm with a piece of wood from his pack and, with surprising tenderness, lifted her from her snowy grave. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, secured her to his own saddle, and turned his back on the valley, climbing higher into the heart of the storm, toward the one place he called home. The first thing Ilara knew was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones, chasing away the gnawing chill that had claimed her. She opened her eyes to the sight of a rough-hewn timber ceiling and the soft, dancing light of a fire. The air smelled of pine smoke and brewing herbs. A heavy fur pelt was tucked around her, and her shattered arm was bound tightly and correctly to her chest. She was in a small, one-room cabin, a space that was both Spartan and profoundly comforting. Every object had its purpose. A stack of firewood, a shelf of preserved goods, a worn leather-bound book on a small table. And across the room, watching her with an unnerving stillness, was the man who had saved her. Silas did not speak. He simply nodded when their eyes met, then turned back to the hearth, stoking the flames. For days this was their rhythm, a silent dance of survival and healing. He would tend the fire, hunt for what little game the blizzard had not driven away, and prepare a thin, nourishing broth which he would leave by her bedside. He never intruded, never asked questions. He gave her the one thing Mayor Thompson never had: space. He gave her silence. As her strength returned, words began to fill that silence. Tentative at first, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through a frozen earth. She told him her name was Alara. He told her his was Silas. She spoke of her journey west, of the hope that had soured into terror. As she recounted the mayor's obsessive cruelty, she saw something flicker in Silas's stoic gaze. Not pity, but a dark, familiar understanding. He was a man who knew monsters. He listened without judgment, his quiet presence a balm on her frayed spirit. One evening, as a storm rattled the cabin's lone window, she asked him about the scar on his face. He flinched, the first unguarded emotion she had ever seen from him. He turned his face toward the fire, the orange light illuminating the ghosts in his eyes. He spoke in a low, raspy voice of a different life, a life before the mountains. He had been a lawman in a town far to the south. He'd had a wife, Anna, and a little girl, Lily. He spoke of a fire, a deliberate act of vengeance from a gang he had put away. He had been miles out of town tracking a fugitive. By the time he returned, all that was left was smoke and ash. He had failed to protect them. The scar was not from the fire itself, but from the desperate, futile fight that followed, a permanent reminder of his failure. The cabin, he explained, was his penance, his exile. He had come here to ensure he could never fail anyone again, by ensuring he had no one left to fail. In that shared vulnerability, a fragile trust was forged. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary. The raging blizzard outside was a perfect mirror for the storms they had both weathered in their lives, and inside, they had found an unexpected calm. Alara began to heal not just physically, but emotionally. She learned the rhythms of the wilderness from Silas. She learned to read the sky, to identify edible plants that grew in the sheltered crags, to mend clothing with a steady hand. She saw the gentleness beneath his hardened exterior, the way he would leave scraps out for the winter birds, the careful way he tended a small, frost-covered plant by the window. He, in turn, began to emerge from his self-imposed exile. Her presence filled the crushing silence he had mistaken for peace. Her quiet resilience reminded him that survival was not just about enduring, but about living. They were two broken souls, finding in each other the missing pieces of their own humanity. A slow-burning hope began to smolder between them, warmer and more vital than the fire in the hearth. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were Silas and Alara, partners in a quiet, fragile world of their own making. Spring arrived with a sudden, glorious violence. The snow receded, the rivers swelled with meltwater, and the aspens began to show the pale green of new leaves. The world was waking up, and with it, the threat that had been buried under the winter's snow. From his vantage point high in the mountains, Silas saw it first. A plume of dust on the valley floor, growing steadily larger. It was a posse, at least a dozen men, riding hard for the foothills. He didn't need to guess who led them. Mayor Thompson's pride was a wound that would never heal on its own. It could only be salved with vengeance. The smoke from Silas's chimney, a beacon of life and warmth for so long, had become a signal fire for his enemy. A cold, familiar dread settled in Silas's stomach. He had run from this kind of confrontation once before, and it had cost him everything. He would not run again. He went inside the cabin, his face set like granite. Alara saw the look in his eyes and knew, before he ever spoke a word. "He found us," she stated, her voice trembling but steady. "He found you," Silas corrected grimly. "Thompson has the law in his pocket. He'll have papers claiming I kidnapped you. He'll tell them you're his property." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "You have a choice. I can create a diversion, give you a chance to run, head north over the pass. Or you can stay," he paused, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "And we can fight." Alara looked around the small cabin, this place where she had been reborn. She thought of the fall, of the suffocating white, and the cold indifference of a man who saw her as an object. Then she looked at Silas, at the man who saw her as a person. She had been running her whole life. She was done running. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I'm not leaving our home." The decision was made. A grim sense of purpose settled over them. They worked together, a seamless unit born of shared hardship. They barricaded the single window, reinforced the door, and laid out Silas's rifle and limited ammunition. The posse arrived just before dusk, surrounding the small cabin like wolves circling their prey. Thompson's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with false authority. "Silas, we know you're in there. You are under arrest for the kidnapping of Alara Vance. Send her out now, and the law will go easy on you." Silas stood by the wall, peering through a small crack in the timbers. "He's a liar," he murmured to Alara. "He has no intention of leaving anyone alive." The first shot shattered the evening quiet, splintering the wood of the door. The siege had begun. What followed was a blur of smoke, splintering wood, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Silas was a changed man. The quiet recluse was gone, replaced by the ruthlessly efficient lawman he once was. He moved with a lethal calm, making every shot count, using his intimate knowledge of the cabin and its surroundings to his advantage. Alara was not a passive observer. She reloaded the spare rifle, her hands steady, her movements precise. She watched the blind spots, calling out warnings, her fear eclipsed by a fierce resolve. They were a fortress of 2 against a dozen. But Thompson's men were relentless. One of them managed to get to the side of the cabin, an axe in his hands, and began hacking at the wall. Silas knew he couldn't hold them off from inside forever. As another volley of shots peppered the front door, Thompson's cruelest deputy kicked it open and lunged inside. Silas met him head-on, the fight descending into a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. As they wrestled on the floor, Alara saw a horrifying sight through the broken door. Mayor Thompson, his face illuminated by a demonic glee, was holding a lit torch. He tossed it onto the dry timber of the cabin's roof. Fire! The sight of the spreading flames sent a shockwave through Silas. For a terrifying second, he was frozen, transported back to another fire, another night of helpless horror. The screams of his wife and daughter echoed in his mind. "Silas!" Alara's voice cut through the fog of his memory, sharp and clear. It was an anchor in the storm of his past. The sound of her voice, of this life he had to protect now, broke the spell. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he threw the deputy off him and surged to his feet. He burst out of the burning cabin, a figure of righteous fury, and faced Mayor Thompson. The remaining posse members, their confidence broken by Silas's defense and the sight of their leader's madness, began to back away. "She is mine," Thompson shrieked, his face a twisted mask of desperation as the flames licked higher. "She belongs to me." Silas stood tall, the burning cabin at his back, a crucible from which he was emerging, finally redeemed. "No one belongs to anyone," he said, his voice low and powerful, carrying across the clearing. "She is a free woman. You tried to break her, to own her, but you failed. All you have is your own empty hate." Alara came to stand beside him, her head held high, her eyes clear and defiant. She was not the frightened girl he had found in the snow. She was a survivor, forged in fire and ice. Seeing them together, unbroken and unbowed, shattered the last of Thompson's authority. His men turned their backs on him, melting away into the trees, abandoning the madman to his obsession. Defeated, Thompson gave one last, hateful glare and stumbled away into the darkening woods, a pathetic figure consumed by his own poison. Alara and Silas stood together in silence, watching as the flames consumed their sanctuary. The roof caved in with a great sigh of smoke and embers, sending a shower of sparks into the twilight sky. It was the end of the cabin, the end of their shelter. But it was not an ending. It was a cleansing. The fire that had represented Silas's greatest failure now symbolized their purification. It burned away the last vestiges of his guilt and her fear, leaving behind something new, something strong. They had lost a home, but they had found each other. In the ashes, they found their future. Months later, the first foundation stones of a new cabin were laid, a little farther down the mountain, closer to the stream. They were not alone. A few of the townspeople, having heard the truth of Thompson's tyranny and his eventual capture by a federal marshal, came to offer their help. They brought supplies and lumber, their faces filled with a quiet respect. They were the first members of a new family, a found family, built not on blood, but on shared courage and mutual respect. Silas and Alara worked side by side, their hands touching as they set a beam in place, a silent promise passing between them. They were building more than a house. They were building a life. Have you ever been pushed to the edge? Have you ever felt like the world was a storm you couldn't possibly survive? Alara's story reminds us that even in the deepest, coldest whiteout, a flicker of warmth can be found. It teaches us that our past failures do not have to define our future, and that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising from the ashes, stronger than before. What do you think is the most powerful force for change? Forgiveness, redemption, or the courage to stand and fight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters. And if you found inspiration in this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of survival and the indomitable human spirit.